I clearly remember the day when my stepmother, Linda, gave birth to my younger sister, Beth, when I was 5 years old. In the waiting room at the hospital, my father, George, held my hand and said, "She's a new member of our family," but for some reason I felt a chill deep in my chest. That uneasy feeling turned out to be justified. Once Beth started to walk, she became the center of the household. Linda would say Beth is like an angel and take pictures of her every little move. Meanwhile, every time someone said, "Grace looks just like her mother," I saw Linda's expression darken. Even as a child, I understood that seeing the image of my late mother in me made Linda uncomfortable. The difference was obvious even at school events. She wouldn't come to my school play, saying she was too busy, but she'd sit in the front row clapping at Beth's performance. Even when I got excellent grades, she'd just say, "Of course you did," and brush it off, while Beth would be praised with a good job for average scores. The birthday gift budgets were clearly different too. I would get practical stationery, while Beth received pretty dresses and dolls. Why am I treated differently from Beth? When I asked my father, he looked troubled and said, "Linda's doing her best. Can you try to be a little patient?" That was the moment I realized. In this house, I was just a guest, and Beth was the real daughter. My father, George, was a completely different person when my mother was alive. Until she passed away when I was 3, he was a loving father. I remember the gentle times when he'd look at my mother's picture and say, "You look just like Mama," then hug me and read me picture books. But after he remarried Linda, he changed. When Linda began treating me coldly, my father gradually started to keep his distance too. He began saying things like, "Please be considerate of Linda, and I want you to be patient for the sake of the new family," and he stopped listening to me completely. The only source of comfort for me was my grandparents. My paternal grandfather Robert and grandmother Nancy would always come to pick me up on weekends. They were the ones most disheartened by how my father had changed. Grandfather was appalled by his son's transformation. "George wasn't like this before. That wife of his has him wrapped around her finger," he'd say to my grandmother. Seeing how excluded I was, my grandparents showered me with even more love. "Your father's pathetic, so we'll protect you," my grandfather said. My grandmother also spoke sadly, saying, "If your mother were alive, she would never have allowed George to become like this." The weekends I spent at my grandparents' house were the only times I could feel the warmth of a true family. There, their deep love filled the void left by my father's lost affection. My grandmother would show me photos of my mother and say, "You really are just like her. Beautiful and smart, and I'm sure she'd be so proud of you." My grandfather taught me math, played chess with me, and encouraged me by saying, "You're a smart kid. I can't wait to see what you'll become." Linda didn't appreciate the affection my grandparents gave me. Those two spoil Grace too much. "I wish they'd treat Beth the same way," she would complain. But my grandparents stood firm. "Grace is our precious granddaughter. We have every right to give her our love," my grandmother declared. Once I entered high school, the difference became even more obvious. When I said I wanted to go to college, Linda made a sour face and said, "That's going to be expensive, you know." In the end, my grandparents paid for all of my tuition. "Education is the best investment," my grandfather said. Your mother would have said the same thing. After graduating from college, I became successful as an economic consultant. Even after I turned 32 and began earning a 6-figure salary, Linda's attitude didn't change. If anything, she became more judgmental. "It's strange that you're not married despite your high income." "A woman's happiness lies in building a family like Beth has," she would say, constantly denying my way of life. Beth had gotten engaged 3 months earlier. My father would only say, "Isn't it time for you to get married too?" and never acknowledged my achievements at work. But then, clouds began to gather over Beth's life at the age of 27. Her fiancé, John, had racked up gambling debts, making marriage difficult. Although my relationship with Linda and my father wasn't good, I had always been close to Beth. Even though I had complicated feelings when she was born, she was still my only sister. She had adored me since childhood, and I had cherished her as well. So when I saw Beth in despair over $30,000 of debt, I didn't hesitate to pay it off for her. It wasn't out of love for the family, but because I wanted Beth to have a chance to rebuild her life. But at the time, I had no idea that this act of goodwill would later cause a major misunderstanding. When Beth was finally able to marry John, I genuinely celebrated her happiness. 6 months after covering the debt, I was relieved to see her finally smiling again. The wedding took place in a small church, a modest ceremony with only close relatives in attendance. After the ceremony, we were having a meal at the reception restaurant. When dessert was served, my father, George, stood up and clapped his hands. "Thank you, everyone. Today was truly a beautiful wedding." He began speaking in an emotional voice. "And I want to thank everyone who made this wonderful day possible." I watched the scene with a warm heart. But the next moment, George placed a white envelope in front of me. "Grace, this is an invoice for you." "An invoice?" I was confused. When I opened the envelope, inside was a detailed breakdown of the wedding expenses: venue fee, meal costs, flowers, dress, photography, a total of $25,000. And at the bottom, written in red pen, Grace's share, $12,500. "What is this?" My voice trembled. Linda answered with a beaming smile. "We're family, so it's only natural to support Beth's wedding together, right? You're single and earn a lot, so we'd like you to cover half." I looked around. All the relatives were staring at me as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. As if this had been agreed upon from the beginning. Why me, without even being consulted in advance? "Well, you're not married and don't have kids, right?" Linda's voice carried no malice. And that made it even more painful. "You don't have much to spend money on, do you? It's best to use it for family. I mean, you even paid off her debt the other day. You must have plenty to spare." "This can't be. And you didn't even talk to me about it beforehand." Linda cut me off. "This is a family matter. We raised you, Grace, so it's only natural for you to give back." Anger rose in my chest. Give back? Was I just an investment to you? Don't say it like that. George tried to mediate. "We're all family. Helping each other is normal, right?" Helping each other? I stood up. "When I paid off Beth's debt, what did you all say? Grace is such a kind girl. And that was it. Is that your idea of mutual support?" The room fell silent. Beth spoke in a small voice. "Grace, please, we're really in trouble." "Because you're in trouble, I should pay?" My voice grew louder. "Why does my single life have to become your convenient wallet?" Linda's expression changed. "You really are a cold person, even though your family is struggling." Cold? I pulled my wallet out of my bag and placed some cash on the table. "This is for my meal. I have no desire to eat with people who push their own financial plans onto others and hand over bills without asking." As I stood to leave, one of the relatives said, "Grace, calm down." "Calm down?" I turned back. "You expect me to calm down after being handed a bill for half of a $25,000 wedding with no prior discussion? Would any of you remain calm if someone suddenly billed you for a wedding you didn't agree to pay for?" No one answered. As I walked out of the venue, I said, "Congratulations, Beth. I hope you find happiness. But please stop trying to buy it with my money." Once I got into my car, I began to shake uncontrollably. I didn't know if it was from anger, sadness, or a sense of liberation. The only thing I knew for sure was that something had permanently shifted in my relationship with this family. 3 days after the wedding, my phone began to ring. The first call was from Linda's sister Emily. "Grace, we need to talk." Her voice was cold. "I heard from Linda about what you did at the wedding." "What I did?" "You abandoned your family. Do you know how much you hurt Beth?" Emily's voice became more emotional with each word. You really are selfish, aren't you? Just because you're single, you think you don't have any responsibilities toward your family? Responsibilities? I tried to stay calm. Am I responsible for paying for Beth's wedding? Of course you are. Emily's voice became shrill. You're family, so obviously you should help. You're single and earn a lot. You have no real expenses. And yet you refuse to contribute to your sister's happiness? That same day, calls started pouring in from Linda's relatives. My cousin Ryan, my Aunt Amber, and even distant relatives I had never met. All of them said the same thing. I can't believe you wouldn't help your family. Just because you're single doesn't mean you get to be so selfish. Beth is starting a family. You should be supporting her. The most painful call came from Linda's mother, Eleanor. I never expected to hear such words from her, someone who had always spoken kindly to me whenever we met. Grace, I'm disappointed in you? Eleanor's voice was full of disappointment. Do you have any idea how much Linda and George loved and raised you? And now you repay them with such ingratitude. Ingratitude? I was nearing my breaking point. What exactly am I supposed to repay? Love. Family love. Eleanor said it as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. You were raised with love, even though you weren't their biological child. Don't you feel any gratitude for that? I've shown more than enough gratitude. I replied. But that has nothing to do with paying for a wedding. Of course it does. Eleanor's voice became harsh. Family is supposed to help each other in times of trouble, but someone as selfish as you would never understand that. After the call ended, I called my grandparents. Nancy answered, and I explained the situation through tears. That's outrageous. My grandmother's voice trembled with anger. What on earth are Linda and George thinking? The next day, I went with my grandparents to visit Linda and George's house. My grandmother was visibly shaking with anger. So this is why we weren't invited to Beth's wedding. She was the first to speak. You didn't want us interfering with your plan to take money from Grace. Linda hastily tried to defend herself. That's not true. It was just a small ceremony. Don't lie. My grandfather Robert cut in with a stern voice. Your relatives were there in large numbers. It's obvious you intentionally excluded us. George tried to mediate. Dad, it's a misunderstanding. It was really a small gathering. A misunderstanding? I stood up. You handed me a $12,500 invoice without any prior discussion, and you think that's just a misunderstanding. Linda's expression grew tense. You're part of this family too. How can you refuse to help when your family is struggling? Struggling? My grandmother's voice turned icy. You planned this from the beginning. You didn't invite us because you were afraid we'd object. That's not. Linda began to say, but my grandfather interrupted. Don't tell me you've forgotten how much Grace has done for you all. She even paid off Beth's debt. And now you say it's still not enough? George spoke in frustration. But Grace is single and earns a lot. It's only natural for her to support the family. And in the future, I'll be inheriting my parents' estate, so when you think about it as a whole family. Then Linda said the decisive words. Exactly. And your parents aren't getting any younger, so we have to start thinking about inheritance too. If George inherits everything, then Grace will benefit eventually, right? So it's only fair that she starts contributing to the family now. The room fell completely silent. My grandmother and grandfather exchanged glances, and I held my breath. How dare you say something like that? My grandmother's voice trembled. So you've been counting on our inheritance too. That's not what I meant. Linda hurried to deny it. No, we understand perfectly well now. My grandmother stood up. If inheritance is going to be discussed, then let me make it clear. All of our assets will go to Grace. George will not receive a single cent. What? George and Linda's faces turned pale. Mom, you can't be serious. We are not going to give our money to a family ruled by a wife who sees her husband only as a source of income. My grandfather's voice was calm, but full of conviction. Grace is the only one who is truly our family. George spoke desperately. Dad, please reconsider. I'm still your son. Son? My grandmother sneered. If you're really our son, then why didn't you stop your wife from treating your daughter like a source of money? You're nothing but Linda's puppet now. Linda made one last attempt to defend herself. But we raised Grace. Doesn't that count for anything? Count for anything? My grandfather's voice rose in anger. So your idea of love is to raise a child just so you can later demand money from her? We stood up and prepared to leave. At that moment, Linda shouted one last thing. You'll regret this, Grace. Do you really think you can go on living alone after turning your back on your family? Without looking back, I answered. If this is what family means to you, then I'd rather be alone. After returning home, I was filled with complicated emotions. There was a sense of relief from being protected, but also a deep awareness that my relationship with this family had been permanently broken. But I had already come too far to turn back. 1 month after my grandparents' declaration about the inheritance, I received a certified letter. The sender was a law firm. I had a bad feeling, but when I opened it, the contents far exceeded my worst expectations. Lawsuit for reimbursement of child rearing expenses. Linda and George had filed a lawsuit against me, demanding $400,000 in repayment. The breakdown of the claim was detailed. Food costs, clothing, education, medical expenses, even compensation for emotional labor were listed as individual items. I consulted with Olivia Bennett, a respected local attorney specializing in family law. She was a stern woman in her 50s, known for her uncompromising stance on family matters. There is absolutely no legal basis for this, Olivia declared after reviewing the documents. When a step-parent chooses to raise a stepchild, it is entirely their decision. An adult stepchild has no legal obligation to reimburse child rearing expenses. Then why file such a lawsuit? Likely to intimidate you. They're hoping that the threat of court will push you to settle with a payment, just to make it go away. On the day of the trial, I went to the courtroom wearing my mother's keepsake brooch. The judge was a man in his 60s, known as an experienced expert in family law, Judge Daniel. First, George gave his statement. Your Honor, we raised a child who was not related to us by blood with love and care for over 20 years. Isn't it only fair to request that some of those expenses be reimbursed? Judge Daniel asked calmly. Who paid for the defendant's college education? That was, my parents did. George's voice grew quiet. And did you provide any financial support after the defendant reached adulthood? No, we did not, but... On the contrary, have you ever received any financial support from the defendant? At this question, Linda and George's faces turned pale. Olivia stood and submitted documents to the court. Your Honor, the defendant has provided $30,000 in financial support to the plaintiffs. The documents contained detailed records. It was evidence of the $30,000 debt Grace had paid on Beth's behalf. Furthermore, the defendant has never received financial assistance from the plaintiffs. Her college tuition was paid by her grandparents, and she is currently fully financially independent. Judge Daniel reviewed the documents thoroughly, then looked at Linda and George with a stern expression. In other words, the individuals requesting reimbursement for child rearing expenses have in fact received substantial financial support from the defendant. Well, that's only natural because we're family. Linda began, but the judge raised his hand to stop her. Because you're family? His voice was as cold as ice. Then why do you demand a one-sided financial burden only from the defendant? Is it because she is unmarried and you believe that gives her a greater obligation? The courtroom fell silent. Judge Daniel delivered his final ruling with severity. This lawsuit is entirely without legal basis. In fact, it is an act of intimidation against the defendant. His voice echoed throughout the courtroom. Adult children are under no obligation to reimburse their parents for child rearing expenses, especially in the case of stepchildren. And then came the decisive words. The plaintiff's actions are brazen and disgraceful. Demanding further money from someone who has already provided substantial support is morally unacceptable. The case is dismissed. Furthermore, the plaintiffs are ordered to pay the defendant's legal fees. As we exited the courtroom, my grandparents walked by my side for support. "You did well." My grandfather placed his hand on my shoulder. "Your mother would be proud of you." But I had no idea this victory was not the end. 6 months after the court ruling, I made an important decision. I decided to live with my aging grandparents. My grandfather was 82, my grandmother 79. They were both in good health, but living on their own carried risks. I purchased a single-story, barrier-free house in the suburbs. It had a spacious living room, private bedroom and bathroom for my grandparents, and a layout with no steps and handrails throughout. I also made space in the garden for my grandmother to grow her beloved roses. To think we'd get to live in such a lovely home. My grandmother was moved to tears. "Thank you, Grace. Truly. Thank you." I hugged her tightly. "It means everything to me to have you both here." Life in our new home was peaceful and fulfilling. In the mornings, I did stretches with my grandfather, and in the evenings, I tended the garden with my grandmother. On weekends, the three of us visited the local museum or library together. It was the happiest time of my life. However, that peace was shattered 3 months later. One Saturday morning, while I was pruning roses in the garden, an unfamiliar car pulled up. Out stepped Linda, George, and Bethany. "Grace." Linda walked toward me. "What a lovely house. It's spacious and it looks like there are lots of rooms. What do you want?" I responded calmly. "We actually came to discuss something." George began to speak. "Beth and John's new place is too small, and if they have a child." I had a bad feeling. "This house has extra rooms, doesn't it?" Linda continued. "We were wondering if Beth and her husband could move in here. We'll pay rent." I was speechless. Even after losing in court, they were still saying things like this. "No, I refuse." I said firmly. "Why not?" Beth spoke for the first time. "We're really struggling. Rent is expensive, and John quit his job. That has nothing to do with me." "You're so cold." Linda's expression changed. "We're family." At that moment, my grandmother came out of the house. "What's going on here?" Her voice was quiet but filled with anger. "It's been a while, Mother," Linda said cheerfully. "Beth and her husband are having trouble finding a place to live." "Leave?" My grandmother's voice was stern. "Right now. But if you don't leave immediately, I'll call the police." After watching the family leave reluctantly, I made up my mind. If I didn't act, the same thing would keep happening. The next day, I went to the police station to seek advice. The female officer in charge listened to me attentively. "This is clearly harassment," she said as she began filling out the paperwork. The matter was already settled in court, and continuing to make such demands is a serious problem. What should I do? First, file an official complaint. Then, we'll issue a formal warning to the other party. A few days later, Linda and George received an official warning from the police. It stated that if they repeated such behavior, they could be prosecuted under anti-stalking laws. Apparently shocked by this warning, they have not contacted me since. About 6 months later, I had an unexpected visitor. The doorbell rang, and when I looked at the monitor, I saw Beth standing there alone. Her face looked completely exhausted. "Grace, sis, please let me talk to you." Beth's voice trembled. I cautiously opened the door. She had lost the brightness she once had and looked worn out. "I've decided to divorce John." That was the first thing she said. "He just can't quit gambling, and he can't hold a job either." I listened in silence. "I came to apologize to you." Beth continued, tears in her eyes. "I'm truly sorry for everything that happened during the wedding. I wasn't thinking at all. I only now realize how much you've done for us." Beth. "What Mom and Dad did was unforgivable too." She bowed her head. "They treated you like a bank. And I didn't say anything. I'm so sorry." I had mixed feelings. The anger still lingered, but I also sensed that my sister had grown. "Thank you for apologizing," I said quietly. "But that doesn't mean we can go back to how things were right away." "I know." Beth nodded. "But if it's okay, I'd like to rebuild our relationship little by little." After that, Beth started visiting our grandparents' house once a month. She had changed. The clingy attitude she once had was gone. She earned a certification and began working hard. We started with light conversations about politics and the weather and slowly began to talk about old memories and even the future. Things might never return to the way they once were. But as sisters bound by blood, maybe we could build something new. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. As our relationship continued to improve, Beth brought up something unexpected. Grace, about Dad. One day she began cautiously. "Dad really regrets everything. He wants to apologize to you." "Dad?" I was surprised. "Yeah, he says he lost his voice to speak up because Mom was always controlling the situation. But after the police stepped in, it finally shook him awake." Beth continued with a serious expression. "He truly regrets hurting you." I hesitated. Fixing my relationship with Dad wouldn't be easy? "I'm not trying to force anything," Beth added. "But I want you to see Dad as a person. He made the wrong choices under Mom's influence, but deep down, he's not a bad man. You know that better than anyone." A few weeks later, we held a small dinner for Beth's birthday. She brought our father with her. Linda was not with him. Grace. My father looked at me and bowed deeply. "I'm truly sorry. I hurt you, and I was the worst kind of father." I listened in silence. "If your mother were alive, she would never have forgiven me." My father's voice trembled. "As a son, as a father, and as a man, I was wrong." We didn't talk for long that day, but his apology stayed with me. My grandparents also seemed relieved by his words. After that, we began meeting once a month for short visits, with Beth joining us. My father was trying to change. He showed interest in my work and started being more attentive to my grandparents. He also admitted his mistakes regarding Linda, saying I should have spoken up more. It would take time to fully rebuild trust. But thanks to Beth, a small bridge had begun to form between us. Maybe rebuilding a family was possible. I began to quietly nurture that hope. Now, I spend peaceful days with my grandparents. I've made friends in the neighborhood and started participating in local community events. Sometimes, I go out for meals or movies with friends. But above all, what matters most is having the power to make decisions for my own life. Not to meet someone else's expectations, but to make choices that bring me happiness. That is the freedom I had long been searching for. Grace, the tea is ready. My grandmother's voice called from the garden. I'm coming, Grandma. I put down my pruning shears and headed back toward the house. Simple, yet deeply fulfilling life. This was the life I chose,